All right, back again, Luke here. And as you can see in front of you, today we have a Lethal Enforcers PCB made by Konami. This was from that set that I wound up receiving recently from a very kind person who wishes to remain anonymous. And it had some sound issues if you were able to see the last video. And if not, I figured we'll go ahead and we'll pop this on and listen to some of that. This is what it's doing currently. You can probably hear that kind of sound in the background. Let's see. That's with a coin in. And this is the sound effects that we're getting right now. But I'm not going to force you to listen through all that. One of the biggest problems here is this Konami Custom 054986, which usually has either dead capacitors or on the bottom, one of the ICs have failed, or in some cases, the traces underneath this chip wind up getting eaten away. Looking at the actual condition of this board here, I'm going to lean towards mostly the capacitors being bad. So what we're going to do today is try and remove those capacitors, clean up the top of that board there, and then hopefully we'll get our sound back and this board will be repaired. So without further ado, I think we'll go ahead and start working on this part. I'm going to remove the JAMA harness to make it a little easier to work on. But there are several different ways that you can go ahead and remove these caps. Some people prefer to use hot air. Other people like to wiggle them off. Some people cut them off with side cutters. I suppose whatever way you decide to go is your choice here, but you have to keep in mind that a lot of these traces, because of the leaky acid, they wind up breaking quite easily. Well, what I do usually is I use the kind of like rock method where I use a pair of pliers and just go very gently from side to side to remove the capacitors. And normally they'll come off without any trouble. I usually go with the same direction as the cap, like where they're soldered. That way I'm not going against it and lifting it up, but just very slowly I'll start to wiggle it. And eventually after, I don't know, a few time, well, a little bit of time here, it'll actually break off and pop off. And I find for me this works out easiest. I know that the side cutters sometimes will work depending on, yeah, you can hear it just pop right there. That's one side that's out. Side cutter method will work sometimes, but you have to be careful of these traces on there. And I'm just going very slightly here. I know that this is, one side is broken off, so it's much easier to kind of wiggle back and forth. And eventually, it'll get easier and easier, and it should just pop right off. Have to wait and see how long this one will take. There we go. I think the paint is holding this one down. As you can see here, here's what it looks like right now. It's really loose. There we go. So this allows the bottom pieces here to remain in place. You'll see that they're not broken. There's still a place to solder to. So we'll use some rubbing alcohol to go over that once we finish. But this cap set here, there are some kits that you can buy for it, and there are places online where you can actually see what the rating is. So I'm not really worried about that right now, since I do know that I can replace these quite easily with that information. So we're just going to pop off all of these ones that we can, and then we'll just go from there. The process does take a little bit of time, you know, but slow and steady wins the race here. If these are really, really corroded, sometimes, you know, I won't even use this. If you try and use fresh solder on it, usually with the corroded parts, it doesn't come off because the solder doesn't stick to anything. So you're just wasting solder and wasting flux. But yeah, it depends on how much damage these things have or how much liquid damage. Like I said, this sometimes takes a little bit of time, but it's not like you do this every day. So it's once you fix it, it's pretty good for a while. Should be good for at least another 20 years or so. One can hope. There's that one. And this leaves a plastic mount here sometimes at the bottom. And once again, with just a little bit of force, you can kind of pull it off. Usually it's just stuck on by the coating from the paint, but you can see our traces are still there, so nothing's been ripped off. Once again, I'm just going right with the solder pieces here to go back and forth. What it's essentially doing is it's breaking the legs at the top rather than at the bottom, so it makes it easier for me to pop these ones off and then change them out. But then obviously we'll go over it with some isopropyl alcohol and try and clean them up. If it really is bad, you'll notice that replacing the caps won't do anything. So in the end, you'll wind up getting a similar effect, even though you have new caps on it. And what that usually means is that under this PCB here, or under this soundboard, usually the traces are eaten, or the traces are eaten on the soundboard underneath it. So this thing's not going to focus very well. It's going to keep flaring out. But I'm going to continue doing this here until we get all of these off, and then we'll come back and I'll show you what it looks like after that. So I'll see you here in a couple minutes. So as you can see here, we have all of those caps removed, and it is a bit grungy underneath there, but it's nothing too bad. It's not like the traces are completely eaten away. You guys can probably see that a little bit better here. It looks a lot worse than it actually is, but with some isopropyl alcohol and some Q-tips here, I think you probably need maybe at least one or two to clean up the area. You can usually get around that grimy, fish-smelling capacitor residue that's usually in there, that electrolytic fluid that spills all over the board here. Some people, they just can't stomach it. Like, it's not the fact that removing these caps or putting new ones on is difficult. It's just when you add heat to these old capacitors or these old areas, the smell is quite horrendous. So next thing I like to do is, just using a bit of a X-Acto knife or something, I like to scrape away a bit of the top part of the solder on here, just to make it easier for the flux and the new solder to kind of mix with it. Because when it's grimy like this, it kind of has a coating on the outside of it. That coating is really difficult to heat up and to allow the solder to melt. So by scratching it a little bit here, it allows the fresh solder, or whatever's left of the remaining solder, to melt a little bit faster. You have to be careful with these because the pads are not very strong on this top ceramic part. So if you add too much heat to it or for too long, you might wind up removing them, and then it's a bit of a pin hunt here to try and find where everything goes. You can see here some of the paint is actually stuck down here. So this is where the not so fun part comes in, with the strong smells and the nastiness. So what we want to do next is, there's a couple of ways of doing it. Some people use solder wick to remove the old stuff. Some people add flux and new stuff there to try and mix the old stuff together, and then they remove that as well. So what we'll do, I suppose, is just try to mix the old stuff on here, and then we'll maybe take it off. I don't know if we can find a good way to keep this up here so you can see a little bit better. And this might not be in focus as well either, so it's kind of hard to get this thing to stay in focus, but whew, focus, focus. There we go, that's a little better. So just using a bit of flux here, we'll go ahead and on the ends make it a little easier to tin these up. Got some dust in here, it's not a big deal. Like I said, I'm just trying to add a little bit here. There are a couple other points on this board that can easily be damaged, and one of them is this transistor at the top. I believe it's a transistor, and the part number on it. I can't remember exactly what it is. It's hard to see here. That has a tendency to somewhat fail as well. So let's see. And we'll just add a little bit of flux there. This will also help to remove those old legs that were on there. Wow, that stuff stinks. Whew! Wow. Gotta have a strong stomach for that. Jeez. Oh, whew, that smell never gets old. Although it smells really old, like 30 years old. Like I said, I'm just kind of tinning these up, and my soldering pen is actually removing the old remnants of what the broken legs were on there too, so it's kind of a win-win situation. I'm trying to do this through the camera, so it's not going to be the greatest. But you can see how the pins are kind of shining up a bit better through this method. And we'll flatten them out at the end here. And go back over it with some flux again. But you'll notice that like some of these legs, they may be already half eaten or partially eaten. So as long as there's something to stick to, that's the most important part. Please do in well-ventilated area. Each time I'm just removing the leg remnants from here. But luckily this one doesn't have so many caps. Some of them have a bit more. It's not too bad. It looks like there's a little crater there. Alright, I've got most of these done. I'm going to use probably a little bit more flux, like I said, and just go back over them to make sure that they're all tinned and okay for new caps. Then we'll go ahead and try and hunt down the caps that we need, and we'll put this thing back together again. So I'm going to continue to go about doing this, and then we'll get the caps on here, and hopefully we'll be able to get this working in no time flat. This is kind of like the first step with these custom, like Konami customs here. It's the easiest way to start off is just with the capacitors, because you know that these have to be replaced. There's no doubt about it. But if that doesn't work, then you have to move on to other points, like I said, on maybe the bottom of the board. Yeah, I don't know if it's the mini amplifier or transistor or whatnot, sometimes goes bad, and then on the bottom of the board, which can be much more tricky because you have to desolder all of these. I think it's like 64 pins or so. It's quite a lot. But so far, this is where we're at with this one. And grab our rubbing alcohol again, a little Q-tip. And don't worry if you spill some rubbing alcohol down anywhere here, it does evaporate. But because the paint is so old, you'll probably notice that it'll come up quite easily. I mean, even since we've started here, most of this paint, especially on the side, already started to come up. It's something that happens with it. The paint's not meant to last forever, but that's where we're at with this. The next part, I suppose, would be just to get those new caps on there. Surface mounted caps. And go from there. Maybe you guys can see this a little bit better. Some people like to remove all of the paint and then repaint it, but I mean, that's for aesthetics if you're looking for functionality first, and then, yeah, if you want to go ahead and go for the aesthetics part later, that's another option. But yeah, you can see we've got all of our points there. They're all tinned up, so they're ready to go. May not look the greatest, but there's a lot of stuff kind of shining, and yeah, there's a lot of reflection going on there. But yeah, we'll go ahead and grab those other caps, and I'll see you here in a couple minutes. So after getting the caps here, what we're going to need is we have 3 of these 10 microfarad 16 volt caps, surface mounted SMD caps. We've got 4 of these 4.7 50 volt caps. And finally, we have 3 of these 47 microfarad 16 volt caps. And we'll go ahead and we'll put these on one by one. And hopefully, by the end, we'll have a nice sounding board that doesn't make any strange sounds. We can hope. Maybe the only strange sounds will be me going, yeah, all right, woo! So, we're going to start off with, I suppose, one of the corner ones. This is our 10 volt, 16 volt, 10 microfarad cap. And we'll probably wind up tinning this a little bit. There are a couple different ways of doing this as well. Some people tin the legs, some people use a hot air station. I suppose as long as it sticks down, you're all set, whichever way that you like to do it. But I'm going to go ahead and kind of tin these legs up just a little bit. Orientation is important, so make sure that you have these placed in the proper orientation. So again, this is going to be a bit tricky because we're doing this from the overhead view here. I'm not sure if this is going to work out so well. I might have to change the orientation of this board just a little bit. I have a little bit of a high spot on this side, which is not making this sit very flush, which is where I suppose hot air might come in quite handy. But the downside of hot air, I suppose, is also that it can be a bit dangerous if you heat it up too much. You can wind up having a cap explode on you, which is something that you really don't want. Make sure you don't bridge any of these points on the bottom here. This is going to be a bit tricky. Like I said, I'm doing this around the camera. Probably should get one of those overhead ones. It might make it a little bit easier. I don't want this orientation to be too far off either, because this is going to be tricky to fix if it is. This thing loves to spin. Okay, I think that one's on there. So what I'm going to do is go around the board just like this, and each one I'll wind up putting on, like I said, through the camera here. It's a bit difficult with these angles, but we'll get that done, and once I'm done with it, we'll test it and see how it works. So just a bit. So one little tip I want to share with you guys here, if you're trying to recap this custom IC, is at the front here, if you notice there's a 16 volt 1000 microfarad cap. If you remove this, it'll make it a lot easier to get access to these caps when you're putting them back down. So it's a kind of small thing to do, but by removing that, it'll give you much better access and a lot easier space to try and resolder these down. So we're in the process here. We've got a couple of them down here. We've still got a few more to go, but we'll get on that and should be done in the next part. So as you can see here, we've got all of our caps back on here. One thing to remember is don't forget to put that back on after you get done with it. And yeah, everything is ready to be tested. So haven't turned this on yet, but let's pop this on and check some of that. See what we get. don't get that popping sound anymore. That's good. Do we get any sound though? Let's see. Okay, it's better, but that's still pretty strange. Okay. It's better, but it's still staticky. So that's not going to cut it. Okay, so I'm guessing what it is. Yeah, that sounds still pretty bad. I'm guessing what this is this something that I've had a problem with before, like I mentioned, and that is this, I believe, was it op amp or IC here? This is another one that goes bad. So I am going to see if I have a replacement, and we're going to take that out and try and replace that and see what happens after that. So see you in a bit. So, after messing around with this top part here and not being able to make much progress with it, I decided to desolder it and check the bottom, which, as you can see here, is heavily corroded. There's a lot of even solder balls where it looks like maybe it had gotten hot and those have bubbled up, but what I think I'll do for this next step is I'm going to try and clean this up. I do have an extra op amp. This is where the op amp goes here, the smaller square on the right-hand side, but I don't have an A9213. So I'm going to hope that it's just the op amp and maybe some corrosion, maybe some eaten traces that it's causing the issue. But at this point, usually people will wind up removing this Konami Custom and then putting that on a repro PCB. But since I don't have one of those right now, I'm going to try and use the parts that I do have and hopefully get this thing back to running condition shortly. But the next step is to try and clean this up and remove that and replace it with another op amp. Check for continuity between these traces, and hopefully we'll get lucky and that'll be the end of it. But that's the next step. So we'll see you back here in a little bit. Here's the old amp that we cut out or removed, and you can see the traces are still there. It seems like we might be able to get away with repairing this part, but what I'm going to do is probably socket this just in case. If there's any trouble, I can just remove it, but that's what we're going to do with this right now. We'll put in the new amp and give it a go. So with our new op amp installed here, what we're going to do next is put in a socket and then plug this in and see how everything works out. That's the next part. I think I'm gonna have to clean out this hole over here because that looks like it's gonna be a bit difficult to get in there, but yeah, next part here. Let's get on to it. Okay, so it took me a little while to get that amp put back in place, but I figured we could go ahead and give this a shot. It's already plugged in, and let's see how it goes. I think that's supposed to be like that. Still no sound here. Let's see. Oh, there we go. That's a lot better. Nice. There we go. Now it's alive. Fantastic. Well, this thing, I don't have the guns hooked up to it, so that's about as far as we're going to be able to see. But as you can hear, the music is pumping, and this thing is playing all right. So once again, another board here saved from the grave. But yeah, I just want to share with you a bit of a look at the way this kind of went from start to finish. And yeah, that's about all for me for right now. Like always, I'll put up another video here soon. So thanks for watching. Watching some Lethal Enforcers, yeah. Fantastic. Woo.